Hello and welcome back to another video in the Complete Web Dev series. In this chapter, we are building a content management system using object-oriented programming. Now, the focus of this isn't to build the best content management system. We're just using that as an excuse to get our feet wet with some object-oriented programming. So that is the motivation, and so let's get going. We are on video 9, and if you have any issues, you can check the description below for the GitHub link for the repository, and just look for the branch V9, and that will give you the finished code for this video. I'm gonna go ahead and switch over to my screen here, and we got XAMPP up and running. What we did in the last video is we created the ability to navigate to, whoops, let me check this real quick, blog foo. We created the ability to call our controller methods dynamically from the URL, and we did that with our route method inside of our router here. So we have this public static method right here. What I'd like to do in this video is just slow down for a minute and write some better error checking here. So what happens if you try to call a controller class that doesn't exist? So I'm going to put here just something that doesn't exist, like register. And you can see that the class register controller is not found. This is a fatal error, and it kills the application. And this is pretty useful, but I'd like to throw a different exception that we can use to make sure that we know, and other developers who might work on our projects know exactly what's causing the error. So what we could do is we can use a built-in PHP function to check right here above this controller class if our controller indeed exists. Now, our controllers are fully namespaced controller here, and so we can check that with the class exist method. So we can say if, and let's do class underscore exists, and that's a built-in PHP function, and the first parameter here is just the name of the class. So we can actually just pass in controller, and then let's just for now let's die, and if it exists we're going to say class exists. Okay, and if we put a semicolon there and save and go back here, let's go ahead and go to our blog foo, because we know that exists. And what we'd like to see is, yep, now we died here on the page, and it says class exists. So we know that that function's working. Let's try one that doesn't exist now. Let's go back to our register and hit enter, and now we have that exception thrown again. So what we can do here is inside this if statement we can throw that exception. So instead of checking if the class exists, we can throw exclamation point here, and that negates that, meaning it's checking if it doesn't exist. So if this doesn't exist, then do whatever's inside of this if statement. Well, what we want to do here is we want to throw a new \exception, which is a built-in PHP class. The backslash here is the actual namespace. It's the root namespace of PHP. So since we're using auto loading, we have to do that. Now what we could do is up here at our use statement, we could say use \exception, and the stupid text editor added that extra little bit there. And then what we can do is here we wouldn't have to do that. We could just do that. But I don't think, since it's just a PHP thing, I don't mind putting that backslash there. So we don't really need to do it here. But I just wanted to throw that out there so we could do that. So that we are creating a new object from this exception class that's built into PHP. And we're going to just give that an error message that makes sense to us. So we could say the controller, and then we'll give it, let's do some backslash quotes here. Oops. We'll do a backslash quote. And in between these backslash quotes, it's actually going to show the name inside the quotes. We can do a curly bracket. And what we're going to do here is do our controller name. And then we're going to say does not exist. And if we save that now and we go back and refresh, we get an uncaught exception because we threw that exception, and it says the controller register does not exist. And I spelled exist wrong. And we can actually, let's try to just controller here and see what that looks like. So now it says the controller app controllers register controller does not exist, and that gives a little better picture of what's going on here, and then it tells us where it's being called, and that's on the router on line 25. Okay, so that gives us a better thing, but what if the controller does exist, but the action doesn't exist? So let's go ahead and check for that as well. And so what we can do there is after this controller class is set, we can actually do another if statement, and we're gonna say if not, there's another one called method exists. And this method exists takes two parameters. The first one is gonna be the constructed object. And so we have the controller class object there as the first parameter. And the second parameter here is going to be the actual name of the method, which in our case is just this action. And then what we can do here is, one second. All right, sorry about that. Had to take care of something. So I'm back now, and what we have is this method exists, which is very similar to class exists, but we got to give it an object, and then it's going to check to see if the method exists on that object. So this is a perfect built-in function for us to use to see if our action actually exists. So if you look at our blog controller, we have two actions here, one called index action, that is a method, and this foo action is also a method. And so this will accurately determine if these exist. Even if the class exists, we need to make sure that that exists. So we can throw a new exception here. And here what we'll do is we'll just say the method, and then we'll do some backtick or backslash quotes here. We'll just say does not exist on the and we'll do that again with some escaped double quotes. So the method does not exist on the controller. And so what we'll do here is we'll just put the method name here, which was action. And then here on the controller, in between there, we will just put controller. And then what we'll do is save that. And now let's go and let's visit the blog controller, which we've already created. And we'll go ahead and just go to foo and make sure that still works. And it doesn't because we must have, and I didn't put a semicolon here, so you guys probably caught me on that. So there's a semicolon. And let's go back and refresh. And it says you made it to the foo action. But what happens if we try to go to a method that doesn't exist? So let's try to go to, let's say, create. And now we get a thrown exception here, and it says that the method create action does not exist on the blog controller. So now we have a little bit more readable errors that get thrown here. And what's great about this is if you throw an exception that's not caught, it does kill the execution of the script. So it won't actually ever call this user func array because these exceptions are going to kill the execution of the router script here. All right, so let's see, what else do we need to do here? I just want to double check my reference here really quickly. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's all we're going to do on this route method. But what I want to do really quick is I don't want to leave anyone behind here. And so what I'd like to do is let's go through the entire every line of code that gets us to this point of printing you made it to the foo action. I really want you to understand what's happening and we'll do this several times throughout this chapter, just to make sure you understand the flow of the application. So typically what happens, and when you visit a PHP site, like for example, when we did our localhost login, and we went to the login.php, it navigated us to the file that's on the server, and so we had to put the .php, and this was the entire file, and it was the same thing if we went to the register form here. So these are actual files that lived on the server, but that's not the way that this is working. And the reason that it's not working, that if you remember, is because we added this htaccess file, which overwrites the server configuration in Apache. And so what this does is we set up some rewrite conditions here, and we said, look, if the requested file name is not a directory and it's not a file that exists on the server, then we're going to send them to the index.php. And so obviously we don't have a file called blog or foo. We don't have a directory called foo here. And so this request is actually being processed through the index.php. And that's the way that this is going to allow us to organize all of our code in an MVC structure and make sure all of our controllers are going to these controllers. We can dynamically do that by making sure the actual app, the entire app, runs through this index.php file. Now, a lot of times this would be called like bootstrapping your application or something like that. But basically what's happening here is every request that we're going to have on our website will go to the index.php. It's not actually going to these other directories or files called blog controller. We wouldn't want that. In fact, I think that might cause a problem if we go directly there. So let's just try that real quick. Let's go to localhost /CMS /app where was that, controllers /blog controller.php, and now we have a serious problem, because like this isn't even found. I mean, this is a problem. For one, the class core controller, it doesn't exist because it's trying to extend that, and it doesn't exist because in our index file we were doing our autoloader. Well, there's no autoloader in this file, so this isn't going to work. But we're going to use pretty URLs because of our htaccess file, and now we can just navigate to our blog /foo. And this is actually loading the index.php file. Now, when it loads the index.php, let's go through this and make sure you understand what's happening here. Once it loads the index.php, we're starting our session here. And this line just makes it so that we can use sessions in PHP. This will actually start or get a session ID from a cookie on the person's browser and resume or start a session with that ID, so that we know from request to request who is using this. We can kind of track them along their journey and do things like keep them logged in and things like that. This next line, this use core, config and router, is the ability in PHP to namespace. And I didn't go much into namespacing before. And the reason that we do this namespacing thing is, let's say that we wanted to start, I told you one of the biggest benefits of using object-oriented programming is we can share classes, and we could share code really easily. Well, you might want to use code that's not yours, like from a library. You might want to use all kinds of classes and stuff like that that are called the same thing. For example, I may want to have a users class in my models directory, and I may also want to have a users class in my controllers. And if I were to do that and I tried to require those, that's going to be a problem, because there's going to be a conflict with both of those having the same name. It's not going to know which user class I'm actually trying to use, and therefore we get to use namespacing. And so if you look at our blog controller, we give this a namespace of app controllers, and what this does is it namespaces this. So it's not likely we're going to have another class called blog controller anywhere, but if we did have another class called blog controller somewhere else, it wouldn't be a problem, because we can choose to use the version from that namespace. Okay, so when we use this blog controller, which we're not really doing, but well, right here we are. So this, in the router, it says use app controllers blog controller, and it's doing that because, and actually we need to remove that. But this is how you would do that, and it's actually going to namespace that and make sure it's actually trying to use it from the correct, not the correct location, but rather the correct namespace. And so that's really important for us to understand, is the namespacing is not necessarily going to be a direct path. This is not a path. This app controller's blog controller, this isn't a path. We're using it in that fashion on our application, but it does not have to be that. And in fact, if we were using Composer or something like that to include other people's work here, a lot of times the namespace would be like the author of the package, and then the package name like this, and then the name of the class within that package. And so a lot of times that is how the namespace would be, and we do that so that we don't have conflicting classes. Now the thing is, yeah, we don't need this here, because actually what we're doing is when we go to use these things, the autoloader is going to go ahead and make sure that those are namespaced correctly with the controller. So we don't actually need to do that. So what we are using though, we are using the namespace, our core, we're using our config class, and we're using our router class. And so we have those defined here in the core directory. Now it has nothing to do with the namespace, but if you go to our config, we namespace that inside of core. And that's the same thing with router. This is also namespace within core. And so when we use these here, we're telling it that anytime we use our config class down here or our router class, that we're actually getting them from the core namespace. Okay, and so this little syntax here is the ability for us to basically group these, so I don't have to put these on separate lines. Since they're both coming from the same namespace, I can group these together like this, and this is like a grouped namespace. All right, the next thing that we're doing is defining a couple constants, and the only reason we're doing this is just so that we can use this within our application. So we're defining them here in the index, and that's a perfect place to define something like this project root with this magic constant here, is because since this is in the root directory of our project, we have a good reference for where that is on the server. And when we want to find a file or something like that, and we use this as a starting point, then we know that it's going to be routed correctly on our server. Now the directory separator is not 100% necessary, but if we were going to share this code maybe on a Windows server or on a Linux server, or if we're even looking at this on Windows, older Windows, the directory separator is actually a backslash on Windows instead of a / like it is on Unix style machines. And so we just define that so later we can use that, like right here in this path where we're using that constant there. The next thing we're doing is we're using the PHP autoload register, and this SPL is just short for standard PHP library _autoload _register. And what it allows us to do is pass in an anonymous function as a parameter, and that anonymous function is going to actually, when we try to use a class in our application, for example, when we're using the router class here or the config class here, the autoload register is going to load our function and pass in the class name that we're trying to load. And so what we do inside of that is we need to kind of tell it where, based on that class name, we need to try to figure out where that exists in our application. And that's what we've done with the parts here. We've exploded that name. So that name will actually look like this. It'll be /core /config when it gets passed in as this class name here. And so we're actually exploding that by the backslash and making an array called parts. And then we're getting our class name by using the last element in that array of parts. So that will be the name of our class. In this instance, it would be blog controller. And then we're going to remove that off the end. And then we're going to try to get our path from the rest of those parts. So we actually implode. Now this is the part that is up to us, and we chose to do it this way, but we are imploding the rest of those parts by the directory separator. So it's going to, in this case, look in core /, which will be in this directory here, core / and then the parts here. And we also do a string to lower because all of our directories are going to be lowercase here. So that just makes sure that the path string will be in all lowercase. And then the next thing that we do is we actually build out the full path by adding the project root and the directory separator here. We add the class, and then the directory, or the path, then the directory separator, then our class name, which in our case was, if we're loading in this config right here, it is just called config.php. So now it knows to look in this config.php. And then we're doing a check, and if it's saying, hey, if that file exists, go ahead and include it. Now what's really cool about this SPL auto load registers, we don't need to use like a require once or anything like that, because this will actually, if it's already been included, it will skip it the next time it runs, and it's not going to include these multiple times. So it automatically takes care of this. So it's a really powerful thing here to auto load our classes. Once we've done that, we have access to any of our classes in our application. So we waited until after this auto loader to start using them. So after we use them, I went ahead and defined this root and this root directory variable here. And we just got from our config file, which is right here, using the public static function get, by the key name, we went ahead and got our root directory. So in our case, it was /cms/ because we're in a subdirectory. Now remember, on a live server, this will probably just be a /. All right, so let's go back here to the index. And then what we're doing is we are actually grabbing from the server. So we have these super globals set up for us by Apache, and there is a key in there called request URI. And what that does is it will get our path here from the URL, or, well, it's not really getting it from the URL, but it will get this URI, and then we can actually use that. So we have access to that. And what we do is we go ahead and get rid of our root. So whatever our root directory was, so that /cms. The reason we have to do that is because this isn't actually part of the path within our application. This is the path before our application is loaded. And so we're just going to go ahead and get rid of that. And that's what this line, the string replace, is searching for that and just replacing it with an empty string. So then we're left with the rest of the URL minus that root string right there. Then what we're doing is we want to make sure that there are no like get variables left in the URL, because that would mess up our our method call. So we're just doing a regular expression using some preg replace to find, using this simple regular expression here, everything that from the question mark forward in the URL, and we're just going to replace that with an empty string here. So what that does is it actually gets rid of anything like this, this ID equals 123. It will get rid of the question mark and the ID equals 123, and then what we're left with in that URL string is just blog/foo. All right, so now if I refresh here, you see that this still works, and that's because of that regular expression replaced there. So let's go back to the code here. The next thing that we do is, once we've cleaned up that URL and we just have that blog/foo, we're going to go ahead and pass that to our route function. So let's take a look at that. In our route function here, we have a static method, so we don't need to instantiate this router class. We can call this a function statically on that, and our URL gets passed in here, and then we're simply taking that URL that gets passed in, and we're creating an array with the parts separated by the /. So if you look at the URL here, the blog/foo is going to be an array with 2 elements in it. So the first element will be blog and the second element will be foo. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to take that first element and we're going to use that as the controller, right? But if we're using like the home page, likely wouldn't have anything. It would look, just like this. It would look like this, and the problem with that is we want to just go to a home page without them having to type that into the path. And so what we've done is we've defined that default controller in our configuration file. In this case, it was blog. And so if we define it in the config and it's not in the URL, we just set it here with this. That's what this line's doing. This is a ternary operator. So this is saying, hey, if it's not empty, go ahead and use it. Use that first element in the array. But otherwise, go ahead and get that from the config file. Okay, so that's how we're getting our controller set here. Then we're creating this controller name setup down here. And then what we can do is we're going to get the full namespace because we know our controllers are going to live in our app controllers namespace. And then we're going to go ahead and uppercase the URL controller name, which would be blog, and it was underscore. So what we end up with is this app /controllers/blog, and then we're concatenating on the word controller, meaning that all of our controllers here are going to need this controller string appended onto them. And so then now we have a full namespace set up in this controller. We go ahead then and we shift off, which takes off the first element of that URL parts array. And next we're going to do the same thing with the action. So this gets the first element in the array, which then in this case where it was blog foo, this first element in the array now, because of that array shift, it's just foo. That's all that's left there now. And what we're going to do there is save that as the action name, and then we're going to append the word action to the end of it, because in our controllers, we want our methods, our action methods, to have the word action on the end of them. Now that's just personal preference, so that we can look at these methods inside of our controllers and make sure that these are actions. Now, if I wanted to create another method in here that's not an action, I can do that, but I just can't call it from the URL dynamically. And there are reasons that you might want to do that. The next thing that happens here is after we have that action name, and again, if it's not defined, we're going to go ahead and grab that, or we're just going to define it as the index. So if there's no action name there, we're going to assume the index action, okay? So again, we use a ternary operator, and if it does exist in the URL, we're going to do that. Then we remove that, we shift, which removes the first element of the array, and whatever's left over here will be used as parameters, and I'll show you that later when we get to this call user func. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to check if that class even exists. So we got this controller right here with this namespace controller, which is a class, and we can actually check with this class exists method, and if it doesn't exist, we're throwing an exception to kill the script, and it's going to print a nice error message to the screen that tells us that the controller does not exist. If it does exist, though, it'll make it past this if statement, and we are going to go ahead and instantiate that controller. So we can use the controller. The $sign controller here is actually a variable name, which will be this fully namespace thing. So what's actually happening in our situation is it's calling new, and then it would be app, new app /controllers /blog controller. And so this is actually what's happening here, except for this whole part right here is going to be stored in this controller variable. So we're using a variable to actually instantiate that controller, and once that's instantiated, that object, and we can assume that it's going to work because we just checked if it exists. If it exists, it tries to instantiate it, and we set that instantiated object to this controller class variable. So now this is stored in memory. Then what we're doing is we're checking to see if the method that we're trying to call, the action method, exists on that object. If it doesn't exist on the object, we're throwing a new exception that will kill the script, and it'll tell us that the method action name there doesn't exist on that controller. If it does have the method, it makes it past this if statement, and we're using a built-in PHP function called call user func array, and this takes as this first argument here, or the first parameter, it takes an array, and the first element of the array is the object that's been instantiated, and then the second element in the array is going to be the method that we're calling on that. So this is going to call this action method, which in our case would have been foo action is the name of the method, so it's right here. We're calling this, so this is essentially the same thing as saying controller class and then calling the foo action like this. But we wanted that to happen dynamically from the URL, and so that is why we were able to pass this in as a oh man, I'm really blanking right now, as a variable. So both our class is stored in a variable and this is a variable. Then what we can do is this function that PHP gives us is really cool, because then we can, as the next parameter, we can just pass in the rest of the parts, which is an array. And what that does is it kind of destructures that array and calls it by like this. However many params there are, they're going to get passed into the method just like that. And so if we're going to use our index example here, it needs those two parameters. So we can say index param1 / param2, and what we get here is you made it to the index action, and then we were just printing param1 and param2, the contents of those, to the screen here. And so that this is the magic of the whole thing right here, but we had to get to the point of getting our controller class and our actions set dynamically from the URL, which is why this is kind of a complicated thing. But that is the whole goal here, is we get that URL, and based upon that URL, we're parsing that string, and then eventually we get to a point of calling the method on this object that we are trying to get to through the URL, and then we're passing in any parameters that we need to, just like that. So that is how this is actually working, and that's where we're going to leave off here in the video. I just wanted to make sure I'm not leaving anyone behind here, and we explained every line of code that we've written so far. The only other thing I haven't explained yet very well is that we started creating this controller class here, which we're going to use as a parent class for all of our controllers. So anything shared that all of our controllers need to have, is we're going to extend this, and it will get any sort of functionality that we put in here. So for example, we put our constructor, which is a magic method given to us by PHP, and we're going to pass in the controller name and the action name here, and we're going to be able to set those here. We're going to do more stuff in this constructor as we go to make this controller more powerful and give us access to things like our request and things like that later. But then our blog controller, you can see that we're going to go ahead and use our core controller, and we're going to extend that to make our children. And so our child class here is called blog controller, and this is a child. It inherits everything from this controller class into this blog controller object. And now we have this object, and we can use these methods within this object, and any parameters within this, however we see fit within this blog controller. So I know this is a little complex, but again, this is like the most complex stuff we're going to be doing, other than interfacing with the database, and we'll get to that. And once that's done, you're going to be able to reuse all this stuff to build your application super fast, because you can just include this core directory and the htaccess and index in any of your projects going forward, and then you can just start adding controllers, models, and views, and you're going to have all the functionality you need to deal with your database, to call your functions, to auto load everything. So you're going to be in good shape. So I hope you guys are enjoying this so far. Go ahead and leave me a comment, like, subscribe. If you're confused, let me know in the comment section, but if you understand, just give me a thumbs up. If you're somewhere in the middle and you're like kind of understand, but a few things confuse you, go ahead and throw it in there. I'll try to answer your questions. But just understand, don't give up. Some of this stuff just comes through repetition and just practice. And so just seeing it and hearing me talk about it, and then possibly sleeping on it and things like that, will start to click. And you know, I heard this analogy once before. Let me go back to my screen here. I heard this analogy once before, and I want to make sure that that I'll leave you with this, and because it made a lot of sense to me, and it gave me hope for when I was confused, or when I wanted to give up when I was learning the program. And what it is programming is so big, right? It's like this huge, massive thing, an undertaking, and you're like in a dark room. And let's imagine that we're all in this dark room with no knowledge, and we're trying to learn this vast thing. And so what happens is, on our journey as we learn, we hear a lot of things, and what it does is it pokes a little pinhole in our little walls. You know, we're in this dark room, and we get this little pinhole, and light comes in through that pinhole and illuminates just a little bit of things around it. And as it illuminates those little bit of things around it, we understand a little bit more, and that pops more little holes in. Before we know it, we have lots of little pinholes in our walls with lots of light, and eventually eventually the room will light up and you will start to see things more clearly. So just try to pick up the nuggets that you can now and think of them as little pinholes that are being put in the wall to allow light in to your brain so that you can see the concepts little bits at a time. And so if you're not completely tracking with me, I wouldn't be too concerned right now. Just understand that what you're doing right now is trying to illuminate just little bits at a time until the picture becomes more clear to you. All right, guys, well, let me go ahead and switch back to my screen, and we'll go ahead and throw this on Git so that we don't forget to do that. So I'm going to do a Git status here, which is going to show me that I've modified my router here, my router file. So I'm going to go ahead and add or stage that. So if I do a git status, you can see that these are staged and ready to be committed. So to commit that, I'm going to do git commit, and then I'm going to do a -m for the commit message. And then inside these double quotes, I can put the message here. So we're going to do better error handling for the router. All right, and then what I'm going to do is just do a git push, and now you guys can go ahead and get that so that at the end of this video here, this v9 will be where I've left off, and we're going to do a lot more changes going forward. So also what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and git checkout main, and then I'm going to merge this v9 into my main branch and push that back up to the main repository. And this main will be up to date, so this will always have everything in it up to the point that we're at. So at the end of this series, this main will be the full project. And if you want to see where I was at the end of each video, you can look at those. And the first three videos didn't have any code that was committed. So it starts with video 4 with the code, and then 5, 6, and so on. All right, so I'm going to try to keep up that pattern so that you guys have separate branches to take a look at if you need to at the end of these videos. So please comment, like, subscribe if you're enjoying this, and you can head over to freeskills.life if you want some cool merch like this hat here, or you'd like a coffee mug here. All right, guys, well, that's it for me. I will see you guys tomorrow.